G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we're looking at my team selection for the Qatar Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you are new around here, you're enjoying the content, as always, please do drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. It goes a very long way. So thank you to all of you guys that continue to engage and support the channel week to week. So right before we jump into how my team did in Vegas and what to look forward to in Qatar, I'll just quickly rewind back to the weekend that's gone by. I was down in Las Vegas with my girlfriend Em for the weekend. It was an incredibly enjoyable weekend, meeting plenty of people. Really interesting event, obviously, and great to return back to Las Vegas for the second year in a row. I think what was most exciting about the weekend for me was to connect with Adam and Terry on the Fantasy Formula, who I co-host that show with every single race week, to do a live in-studio recording at the Sirius XM studios in Las Vegas. The first time the three of us have all connected in person together, and to have done an in-studio recording was truly such an exciting opportunity. It's great to see the show evolve over the last 12 months or so to get to a point that we're able to share the kind of insights and information with you guys in that kind of environment. And the reception to that was obviously very positive. So hopefully we're able to make something like that happen next season as well. Also had the chance to go to the Fan Amp meetup on the Friday. So shout out to Jared from Formula Bone, Nick from Formula Habits, Miguel, a friend of the channel, and all the other interesting folks I connected with there, because it really makes the excitement of being part of the F1 community that much more. Just one other thing before we jump into Las Vegas recap. There's still time to complete the F1 Fantasy Community Survey. I mentioned this last week in my video, and if you haven't done so already and want your voice to be heard on changes to the game in 2025, which has been rubber stamped by F1, we will share these results with them at the end of the season to incorporate into their end of season review on the fantasy product. I have the link in the description of the video and as well in the comments if you do want to complete it. We've had over 250 respondents already and really hope to have a few more before the survey closes at Abu Dhabi. So we've got a couple of weeks left to collate those results and look forward to hearing from you guys as to what you'd like to see changed in the new year. So in terms of how the team did in Las Vegas, heading into the weekend was definitely looking to go a little differential, and there was a lot of cause for optimism for Ferrari, given the fact that the circuit itself is more or less a rectangle. Their straight line speed, we know, has been excellent all season, and was eyeing off Charles Leclerc as a 2X for his consistency. He's had scores of 20 or more points in the last 10 races, so a real good omen for him. Have been rolling with Carlos Sainz for the last few weeks, so I thought that was probably going to be the way I stayed for my second premium, and then drafted in Liam Lawson to replace Zhou, who surprisingly enough got out of Q1 for the first time in what felt like a millennium. So a solid result, but I think the biggest surprise of the weekend was the emergence of Mercedes. Now they looked particularly good in all three free practice sessions. George and Lewis topped them all. And I think the story of the season for them, as I've talked about a little bit already, is the fact that they do look particularly good in practice and then just fall away in qualifying and the race. But I think particularly because of the colder climates where they have done well in other races earlier in the year where it has been a little cooler, Mercedes were actually able to capitalize on that. And although we didn't quite see that in Mexico, which was also quite cool, they did end up with a 1-2, and I think that was a great result for George, who won his second race of the season, and then Lewis to come all the way from P10 to second place. So a massive result for Mercedes. Interestingly enough, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, George didn't win driver of the day, and I kind of get the feeling that more often than not, if it's not Max or maybe even Lando Norris now that's winning the race, it's usually someone who finishes second or someone who ultimately wins the race that comes away with that points bonus. So all in all, a pretty solid weekend. No DNFs. Dodged Alex Albon and Gasly, who unfortunately fell to his fourth in the last 5 races, a DNF there, Alex Albon. So 239 points, and the rank just didn't change. I've got my rank screenshots for the last 2 weeks actually on the screen here. I had the Brazil rank in my last team selection video, and the change between the last 2 weeks has been less than 100 for my team 1. For my team 2, it moved 4 positions. 2.2 in the world for Team 2, but Team 1 is the one I talk about on the show, the one that I've more or less focused my analyses on, and yeah, less than 100 rank moves. So it's going to show that so many teams have more or less the same assets week in, week out. McLaren, Ferrari on F1 Fantasy Tools, very highly owned assets, and it's very much coming down to small differences to really make the move. So if you had Mercedes, let me know in the comments below, because for those of you that did take a punt on the constructor, on Lewis Hamilton, on George Russell, I'm confident that you would have seen a green arrow, unless, of course, you were hard done by the Gasly and Albon DNFs. In terms of looking towards Qatar, now, a couple of interesting talking points. Some will spend more time on than others, but I think the general consensus for this race, in particular, a sprint race weekend, so an extra session of racing, an extra session of scoring points, is that McLaren have been very competitive in high-speed corners all of season and into last season as well. And I do think they deserve to be the favourites heading into this track. They struggled quite a bit in Las Vegas. Both Lando and Oscar finished behind Max Verstappen, who won his 4th World Drivers' Championship and finished 5th in Las Vegas. But I do think McLaren will return to the winner's circle here. They had a great result there last season, and I definitely think the car itself will be very much suited to these conditions. The other thing to think about as well is that it is quite challenging on tyres, and I guess to the contrary of McLaren, their rival in the constructors, Ferrari, have been very good with managing their tyres in 2024, and the track itself is very good for overtakes. It was top 5 for overtakes last season, and I think on a sprint race weekend, having those kind of drivers that can get you those overtakes, whether it's top drivers that maybe qualify out of position, or those midfield drivers like Kevin Magnussen, Tsunoda, even Hülkenberg, someone who I thought would struggle in Las Vegas, but actually was the highest scoring C-tier driver of them all, I think are assets worth eyeing off heading into this weekend. So if you've got 3 free transfers available, like myself, and you're looking to structure your team around overtake guys, around kind of high ceiling assets, then I definitely think having that additional flexibility is going to put you in good stead for this weekend. George Russell, I alluded to this just before. He won his 2nd race of the year in Las Vegas after capitalizing on Lando and Max coming together in Austria. And if you rewind, go all the way back to Spa, where he was on track for another win there and then was disqualified, Lewis obviously took that win as well. George hasn't had driver of the day in any of those 3 races. It is quite interesting to me that Lewis, who won, I say won, obviously, when George was disqualified in Belgium, won driver of the day there, and Lewis also won driver of the day in Las Vegas. So, and then George again in Austria when he won, Lando Norris won that driver of the day. So, although he seems to be a very reliable fantasy asset, particularly recently, the last 7 races, he scored 19 or more points. So that consistency at this point end of the season is obviously a great sign. But obviously just doesn't really have the backing from the fans as a popular asset to want to encourage people to vote for him. So another weekend where Woody, as people sometimes call him, misses out on that extra 10-point bonus. Speaking of extra 10-point bonuses, Lando Norris clinched that fastest lap at the end of the race to steal that away from Lewis Hamilton, if I'm not mistaken. So Lando owners, a little bit of a get out of jail free card, if you ask me, because he was well off the pace, and that was what edged him ahead of Leclerc by a couple of points in the weekend just gone, where I think Leclerc objectively looked like a much better driver, both in practice and on paper and on the race day. So I think driver of the day, fastest lap, again, another metric that seems a little overinflated. My 2 cents just quickly on the F1 simulation data. Now, they had Mercedes 4th in race pace for this. Lawrence Barretto puts this out after FP2 every single race week, and I think they probably were underselling them just a little bit. So it's, I think, a useful metric, but also one that kind of reminds me that you should more often than not just go with your gut. And I didn't go with them, not just because of the race pace data, but also because it was going to be multiple transfers to back Mercedes out of my team in Qatar, where I don't think I want them, unless, of course, it gets to a point where I'm going hyper differential Las Vegas, in hindsight, was a great weekend for that to go a bit differential because of the conditions and the fact Mercedes did seem to look good on paper in practice. But just one of those things that I think it's very easy to get caught up in all of the data and information that can sway our decision making. And sometimes maybe just parking that to one side and going with, what your head thinks is the right call can sometimes put you in good stead. And I think for next season, that will be something I definitely think more seriously about, being more aggressive with my decision making and going with what my gut says and not necessarily every single data point on the planet. And also on Williams, we saw Franco have that crash in qualifying. An incredible job done by the Williams engineers to get that car back into a position to race and start from the pit lane on Saturday. But Williams, as we know, in the last 4, 5, 6 races have had rotten luck. Both drivers crashed out in Brazil. Albon's on a streak of 4 DNFs in his last 5 races. And I think given how few parts they have to repair the car week to week, even though we have got 2 races left where I don't think DNFs are going to be quite as high, to avoid the headache of having to transfer out Albon, certainly Albon, I think Colapinto is slightly different because he is a very cheap and budget enabling asset. I think just avoiding that headache of Albon having to be moved out of your team, or if he does get to a point where he just cannot race, as we've seen in Brazil, where he couldn't make it to the grid, then I think it is very much something to just completely wash your hands of and avoid entirely. So Colapinto, just because of his price, I think is a slightly harder decision unless you've got a quite high budget. But Albon, certainly for the last 2 races, if there's any possibility he can't participate in a race because of an incident in Friday or Saturday, is obviously going to be problematic for fantasy owners if you've got him in your team. Now, quickly on Qatar and a weekend that a lot of you watching this may well have your 3X chip available to use. There's a couple of different options for your team this week. I'm sure you watching this have thought about this as well. I think the most popular option is going to be Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri because of that McLaren high competitiveness in the high-speed corners. I definitely think Lando has been, along with Charles, one of the most consistent assets, not just this season, but certainly in the last kind of 8 to 10 races. Lando's had 7 scores of 29 or more points in his last 8 race starts. So I do think that consistency is something that will hold him in good stead for 3X users. And then Oscar hasn't looked all that great lately, but I do think he'll return to maybe not winning ways, but certainly in contention for a podium this weekend. He had driver of the day at this track last year when Max won the World Drivers' Championship. He won his sprint race there and also finished on the podium in 2023. So I think Oscar's got a lot of good omens at this track. I think the alternate to him, although maybe not at Las Vegas, a result he was looking for, finishing 4th, Charles Leclerc has proven to be an extremely reliable option at this stage of the season. I do think there's at least some opportunity for him to win once more before the end of the year. And unfortunately was beaten out by Norris in fantasy just because of that driver of the day vote. Leclerc's on 10 races of 20 or more points. So I think, again, another consistency streak that should not be ignored. I think most people will probably be going down this route as for the 3X. If you've got a lower budget like me, I think the 2 most obvious options are Lando Norris and Carlos Sainz, or Charles Leclerc and Oscar Piastri. And I feel like it's pretty close between these 2 combinations as to how you position your team for that. You could go in a number of different directions with a McLaren Ferrari combination if you're mixing up your constructors or your back markers. But I think for people around that, like 126, 127 or less, I think it's probably about 126 because that's, I believe, about where my team is. The middle 2 options here are probably the most popular. So I'm looking at both of these in Qatar. And then I think for a differential, I've just put any 2 names on the screen here. But Oscar, I think not many people would put the 3X on him. If you're using the 3X, I think Lando's the most logical option. But as I said, Oscar's got a great track record there in his rookie season. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see something similar from him in Qatar. So that's why I'm very much considering a Piastri-Leclerc combination. I think not many people will have that driver combination, but if you want to go hyper differential, Piastri and someone like George Russell, who looked, as we know, very good in Las Vegas. I don't know necessarily if Mercedes suddenly can replicate that in warmer climates, but just something to think about. I think those differentials are going to be the two Mercedes drivers or Max Verstappen, just because of Max's $32 million premium price tag. So definitely a lot of options. If you've got one of these combinations in mind, let me know down in the comments below. But I'm certainly at the moment set on running either the Lando Carlos or the Charles Oscar Piastri because of my budget, even though if I had the money, I would absolutely be going for Lando and Oscar at this point in time. Quickly on power rankings, a little bit of shuffling in the C tier. I wouldn't say there's been much change in the A tier. Norris and Leclerc, to me, still the best two options if you can stretch to them. Piastri moving up, not necessarily because of his result in Las Vegas, because it wasn't by any means his best, but just because I think he's well positioned for a good result in Qatar if McLaren's kind of performance in those high speed corners can translate. Again, in the B tier, not much change either. I think Sainz and Ferrari much more competitive at most circuits compared to Hamilton and Russell. I'd love to put Lewis and George above Carlos after that race, and I think deservedly so. But for the next couple of races, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Sainz for me is, again, because I own him, perhaps is maybe why I feel that way. But I think Ferrari have more often than not been the more consistent team than Mercedes this season. Colapinto, I've got a green arrow next to him. I mean, he can't go any higher in the C tier. Again, another $0.5 million increase for him. He's looked excellent. Again, to especially bounce back from that result in Brazil, which and also not to mention the crash in qualifying, to come away with 10 points at a track like Las Vegas, which is by no means an easy one, is a great result. It was actually his second highest score behind his debut of 11 points in Monza. So a great result for Franco to rebound from last week's disappointing result and to start from the pit lane and make his way up the grid, passing 4 cars and gaining 6 positions to come away with 10 points. Obviously great. Hulkenberg, alluded to him earlier, another great result. Now, I think the story for Hulk in particular was that going into Vegas, thought he'd qualify, and then, as has been the case a few times this season, dropped back. But Nico did very well to actually not just hold on to his position, but even get further ahead. So he finished the race, Nico, with 17 points and his best result since Austria Sprint. So to do that kind of fantasy performance in a non-sprint weekend, which is his best non-sprint weekend. Actually, no, it was Canada, 19, and then, Las Vegas, 17. To qualify P9, to gain a position to P8 and make 10 overtakes in the process, a great result for the Hulk. So I think another driver I'd be looking at in Qatar if you've got the budget. And then Albon, as I mentioned, 4 DNFs in his last 5. I'd be looking at Zhou, Bottas as alternatives to Albon, just because of that concern around Williams and whether or not they'll have cars ready if they have any more incidents on track. And then heading into team selection, the mainstream DRS boost options, Norris, Piastri. I think Leclerc is certainly in the conversation as well. And as we talked about, a Mercedes asset could be a nice differential. And I think, as I've mentioned, 3X is going to be the most popular chip this weekend. If you've got Limitless and 3X, I'd still recommend. I think I'd probably say it's hard. I think you could make a case for both, because on Limitless, you've got those overtakes, and if you get premium drivers that qualify out of position, that can certainly aid your team. But if you ace the 3X chip on the right driver, we saw last year that 3X teams could easily outscore Limitless teams. I think it's been a lot more even this season, but I'd be targeting the 3X for anyone who's got it left. And if you don't have that left, I think Limitless or no negative, great chips to use this weekend. Autopilot, I just don't think, unless you're planning to use wildcard in Abu Dhabi, I'd just use any other chip this weekend, and 3X at the top as probably the best chip to use, given the extra sprint session of racing we've got on the cards. So I do want to just quickly swing across to my team. Just bear with me for 1 minute, bring that up on screen for what I've got heading into the deadline this week in Qatar. So this is why I had triple Ferrari, and I'll probably, if I want to go a little differential, maybe even think about sticking with this lineup. But as we talked about before, I could also go down the path of a Leclerc Piastri potentially. I'd have 9.7 to bring in Zhou. I mean, it's not great, but as I've talked about in other videos, being a bit hard done by DNFs, B tier DNFs, for example, and just missing price rises at the wrong time. So that's probably where my head's at. Again, if going all the way back to Coda, I would have had the same premium budget, a premium driver pairing. So more or less will be the same team, but I think if it's not Leclerc Piastri, it's probably going to be Norris Sainz. I have 1 million, but 9.7 is not going to get me anything aside from Albon, if I'm not mistaken. And as I've said, I think I'd much rather Zhou a P20 merchant who's just going to rack up a few positions gained with drivers ahead of him DNFing. And I think being so far back means he stays out of the chaos further ahead. So that's why I like Zhou over Albon. So I could see something like that. But then if I want to go super differential, because there's already going to be a lot of 3X chips flying thick and fast this weekend, I could think about bringing in Mercedes constructor. Again, I think a lot of this very much relies on certain things happening to obviously take advantage of DNFs, which again is an inherent issue with the game. But if I, for example, thought Oscar Piastri, if he doesn't look like he's well on the money in practice and sprint qualifying, and I think that curse which he escaped in Las Vegas, which I placed on him with Dark Magic last weekend, might potentially arise in Qatar, then I could go for just Lando Norris, avoid Oscar Piastri and McLaren, bring in someone like Charles Leclerc, and then that would give me enough for Zhou. But I think that's kind of just hoping on a prayer that Oscar Piastri DNFs. And I think if you're playing fantasy that way and hoping for DNFs, although that's the way to make up the most rank, if you're hoping for them, it's just not going to work out that way. So unfortunately, can't even get to triple McLaren. Unfortunately, I'm 0.4 million short of doing that. And I just don't think, I could, but I don't think going for Lando and Oscar, but a Mercedes and Ferrari constructor makes a lot of sense, because if you've got the 3X on these two guys, you obviously want them to do well, right? And to obviously increase the ceiling of your team, you obviously want to have McLaren in there as well. So it seems a bit counterintuitive to own these two guys without the constructor. So I think that's why I'd be going down a different path this weekend in Qatar. And unfortunately, as I said, that's kind of just how my bed's been made. But we'll just have to grin and bear and hope for the best. So I'm obviously just kind of playing around at this point, but a few different options on the cards. Nothing locked in, and want to see sprint qualifying and free practice on the Friday to make my judgment call there. So a couple different combinations, but one thing's for certain, I'll almost certainly have these 5 slots locked in, and the 2 up here are very much up for debate. So if you've got your 3X on the cards this weekend, let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear what your strategy is, and if it's very much one of those options we had up on screen before, or a completely different route altogether. But I'm going to leave it there for now, guys. We'll be back with the fantasy formula for another deadline stream an hour before qualifying on the weekend, so you can catch me there next time. As always, appreciate the love and support on the video. Good luck with your teams this weekend, guys. I'll see you all very soon.